Hello, welcome back. I'm Earl from Briefing Monthly, and I'm very glad to be back here today with Ed Johnson from Bloomberg to try and wrap this very interesting conference up. It's not the end, we've still got the keynote speech to come, so stay with us. So Ed, it's there's nothing like a lockdown coming to an end here in Sydney and talk about Chinese planes flying around Taiwan and constant talk about whether or not supply chain disruptions are going to continue for a lot long further to fill a day like this. But after about 5 hours of fantastic sessions at Bloomberg, you've got to turn this sort of thing into stories. So what do you think is actually going to make the cut today?
That's right, Greg. We're always busy trying to turn around stories as quickly as possible. Great to see you again, albeit virtually. It's a shame we can't be there in front of the glorious view over Sydney Harbour. But yeah, another great event today. It's been a super session and plenty of news. Let's start off with that first panel, which really did get us off to a great start, moderated by Heidi Stroud-Watts there. I was really struck by Chris Andrews' thoughts around the need to open our international borders. You know, he said that Australia can't remain a prosperous country if it continues to be isolated. And Chris reiterated a point that we quite often hear from international bankers in particular. You know, he said that business is a contact sport, and there's only so long that you can continue to nurture relationships via Zoom. You know, he said that La Trobe's currently drawing on a pool of goodwill to keep relationships going, but he warned that pool is finite. And that's something that we hear quite a lot when we're interviewing people in the financial industry at Bloomberg News. As Vice Chancellor of Sydney University, Mark Scott also has reasons to be concerned about the closed borders. You know, that's kept international students out since March last year. They make up roughly a quarter of all enrolments at Australian universities. That's the second highest proportion in the world, behind Luxembourg, incredibly. So clearly that's had a huge impact on education sector revenues. Key competitors like Canada, they've been quicker at opening up, and Mark did note the threat from such competition unless, he said, we rebuild quickly. Another thing he pointed to, you know, pre-COVID, about a quarter of Sydney University's enrolments were Chinese students, and he did note the need to diversify that base. Mark Beckier of Star Entertainment, he's also got a lot of eggs in the China basket, but he was very bullish about the prospects of a swift snapback in terms of tourism and Chinese visitors to casinos once the borders reopen. Another standout panel for me, not surprisingly, given that I work for Bloomberg, was the economic discussion moderated by Stephanie Flanders, who was very kind in doing that at 6 a.m. in the morning London time. So I've thanked her profusely for that. Bruce Gosper, he gave a rather sobering assessment of the impact of COVID on the region, particularly for those 2/3 of workers who lack social protections and work in the informal sector. And he said that the pandemic had more or less stalled poverty reduction efforts. Despite that, Vera said that COVID wouldn't terminate the Asian century. Interestingly, she is, though, keeping a very close eye on China, where slower growth amid Beijing's common prosperity push, its tech crackdown, and efforts to curb debt will have an impact on the region and ultimately impact global growth as well. What stood out for you, Greg? What were the highlights?
Well, I thought that first session was interesting too, particularly the challenge of complying with the Australian government's effort to diversify, but yet Matt Beckier and Mark Scott, big services exporters from Sydney, still counting on Chinese students coming in. So that's going to be an ongoing tension, I guess. I really thought the most interesting panel was the one on the Quad. We were really lucky, privileged to have representatives of all 4 countries, senior representatives, very articulate representatives of those countries, talking after the Quad Leaders Summit. But first, perhaps I should go to the quite interesting poll we did with that session, where we saw that the AUKUS submarine partnership really received very little support as a priority diplomatic objective from our audience poll, with the Quad and bilateral engagement coming up as the strongest favoured options, with about a quarter of the pollers supporting each case. It's quite interesting. We've had 3 big opinion polls here in Australia on AUKUS of the general public, and they've all shown majority support for the partnership, but the respondents weren't given any choice. In this case, we've got a more sophisticated audience, and we've given them a choice, and they've come up with quite an interesting, differing sort of assessment. I think, though, that just shows the, and of course, the trade option was the strongest favoured option with 40% of the respondents. So that's a very interesting way for us to be looking at the world when AUKUS has had all the attention in the last few weeks. I think it really just shows that there's a lot of opportunities there for Australian diplomacy, but there's also a lot of challenges delivering on all of those different options at the same time. If anything, it probably makes the case for better funding for Australian diplomacy to deliver on that sort of very diffuse outlook on the world that was revealed by the survey. But onto that panel, I think what was most interesting about that panel was the really granular insight we got into how the Quad is perhaps now going to operate. Now we've had the Leaders Summit, and it's really established as a regular annual leaders level summit. And there we saw a lot of talk about expansion, actually, from Sergey Goldman from the US and from Ambassador Yamagami from Japan, talking about, I think we heard talk about more involvement with the EU, Southeast Asia in that group. Vietnam kept coming up. It keeps coming up as a potential Quad member all the time. That was a bit of a contrast to our own foreign minister when she did the 2+2 tour of Asia before she went to Washington. And she sort of was inclined to say the Quad didn't need to expand very fast. And I think Ambassador Yamagami came up with a very interesting formulation about how we shouldn't focus so much on the Quad as a group of democracies, but as a group of countries that really favour the implementation of consistent law, and that allows countries like Vietnam to come in. Very interesting. Just continuing on with that theme, there was a lot of talk about whether the Quad would become an institution. This is the whole idea that it might overshadow the secretariats we have in Asia, like ASEAN and APEC and so forth. And there we saw a very firm no to the idea that we're going to get a Quad secretariat, but we got quite an insight into how the Quad working groups are going to be strengthened very much, and they're dealing with very complex issues, and it seems that's where the heavy lifting will go under the water, so to speak. But if you put together experts from the US and Japan and India and Australia in working groups, you're going to get mini secretariats in some of these areas, I think, compared with some of the other institutions we possibly have in Asia. So that's going to be an ongoing sort of tension and something to watch. And thirdly, we saw the 2 non-AUKUS members in that group, High Commissioner Vora from India and Ambassador Yamagami from Japan, give quite different answers to the question of the relationship between the Quad and AUKUS, with High Commissioner Vora really saying they're quite different entities, which has been the long-standing Indian position since the AUKUS announcement. Whereas Ambassador Yamagami, with the new Prime Minister back home in Japan, really talked up the idea that they're not unrelated, and there's a real need in the region for the deterrence that AUKUS will give. And just summing up that session, I really think the most poignant moment was very at the end when Ambassador Yamagami pointed out in a heartfelt and very frank way for a diplomat that Japan can really empathise with France submarine contract. Pointed out that 5-6 years ago, Australia didn't take the Soryu Japanese submarine, which they thought they were going to sell us, and he understands how France feels. It struck me that perhaps instead of sending Trade Minister Dantian off to France to have an unsuccessful meeting with French officials, perhaps Australia should draw on its good friends in Japan and send off someone like Yamagami-san or one of his colleagues from Tokyo to fix the problem for us. So that's probably enough talk about what I think was really an insight into, we actually saw diplomatic institutions being built before our eyes in that session. It was so rich with detail about this new institution. So, but anyway, Ed, back to you. We should get on to the polls.
Yes, Greg. It's become a bit of a tradition for us, hasn't it? That we take a look at some of the audience polling. Now, a perennial favourite. We've been asking it for this is the fourth year now. We've been asking this question: how has Australia managed its relationship with China? Now, 45% of respondents this year said that it had been clumsy and inconsistent. How does that compare with previous years, and what do you make of that?
Well, that was an interesting change. I remember back when we first did this poll question, and our now Asia Society colleague, Richard Maud, was sitting in the audience, and the poll came up and said that 75% of our high-end foreign policy literate audience that we get at this session, at this conference, thought that Australian diplomacy towards China was clumsy. So we're now down to 45%. So that's a sort of a net improvement for Australia, I suppose. Although I would, perhaps suggest that that's more due to China's clumsy behaviour, if not inconsistent behaviour, rather perhaps than new Australian strategies. But that's a question for another poll, so we might save that one up for next year. What did you make of the country's poll?
Maybe the audience. Maybe the audience there running out of patience with China's wolf warrior diplomacy. Another poll I found really interesting, and again on the China theme, which country in the region presents the biggest opportunity for Australian business? And again, it's one that we've asked year in, year out. Now, only 14% of respondents this time said China. That's down from 55% in 2018 when we first asked that question, down from 43% last year. Now, that clearly reflects the ongoing diplomatic tensions and the wave of punitive trade actions against Australian exports, such as coal and barley and wheat and wine. Interestingly, 35% saw Indonesia as the biggest opportunity. That's up from 23% last year. And India at 32%, also up from 23%. What did you make of those results?
Well, it's quite striking. Our trade with China has stayed up because of iron ore exports, but that's showing a decline in business sentiment for sure. Indonesia and India, they're the two big countries that DFAT has produced reports on. They're seen as the big diversification options. But I thought the interesting newcomer there in the poll, which we didn't have last year, was Vietnam, that had about as much support as Japan and Korea. So we're running short of time now, Ed, so perhaps we should just cut back to you to wrap this session up again. Thank you.
I think we should indeed. Greg, it's been a pleasure yet again. Hopefully next year we'll be there in person in the Bloomberg offices.
I'm looking forward to it.
In wrapping up, I do want to thank the Asia Society for giving Bloomberg the opportunity again to partner with you on Asia Briefing Live. The event's in its fourth year now. It just keeps going from strength to strength. The Asia Society is providing such clear thought leadership on such a complex region, and it really has been a privilege to be involved in today's discussion. So thanks very much indeed. Our next and final keynote speaker will be live in just a few moments, so please do stay online and enjoy our final session. Thank you for joining us so far today.